Okay, so thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. I want each of you to kind of start out telling me or sharing with me how you became involved in signing the response letter. And I think it's probably best to start with Mio because, as I understand, you're the one who brought Shannon and Siobhán in, right?
Yes, that's correct. So it's early July, and we're in the middle of all of the racial justice uprisings that are occurring all over the country. And Harper magazine decides to drop this letter called A Letter on Justice and Open Debate. The letter has like over 150 signatures on it, and it includes like a lot of prominent folks. J.K. Rowling, Noam Chomsky's on it, and it's a letter that grabs a lot of attention, probably in large part because of the folks who signed onto it, but also because it's essentially this call that's like vocalizing their concerns about what they frame as the erosion of like public discourse. And the reason they say that there's this erosion of public discourse is because themselves and their colleagues and the folks around them apparently are starting to feel too scared to say anything, to publicly think, in fear of retaliation. And the letter is very vague, right? But in the context of events around the letter and the folks who signed onto it and the framing of the vague language, it's really clear that it's a letter against what they understand to be cancel culture or any sort of calling out. Um, and it it also frames specifically this idea of things going too far because it's uncivil and civility. Like these are themes that they stress and talk about in the letter. So it goes out and I read it and I feel really annoyed by the letter. That's a really big understatement. And it I understand like with everything going on that it's not particularly like the most important thing. These are really elitist folks and they're talking about institutions that a lot of people um, don't have access to. And they are talking about an issue that is in a particular bubble of those institutions. But because I have worked and gigged around these different media outlets and have also, been in academia, it is particularly annoying because it is this reiteration in this moment of time of a debate that's been happening over and over again within these institutions that feels really out of touch. Um, and I also realized looking at this letter that somebody that I actually worked with was a signatory as well, which was just ramped that irritation level up even more. So people are talking about the letter and it's annoying. And I remember myself just because it's what we do, I just started writing and ranting to myself, not really anticipating anything. But a friend who works with The Objective, a like very small Substack newsletter that is specifically like made for people of color journalists to be able to like publish content that a lot of editors are not interested in publishing for whatever reason, which usually the reason has to do with clicks and likes and finances. And I know this because that I've sat in the newsroom as those decisions have been made. But the objective, decides that they're going to publish a letter, and a small group of people of color journalists had been working and writing together and crafted this letter that was basically a long, very long um, rebuke of this letter that Harper sent out. And it's particularly long because there's a lot of evidence in it. There's a lot of evidence taking apart these scenarios that supposedly fit into the concerns that the initial Harper's letter is talking about. So I get tapped to take a look at this letter, see if I wanted to sign on. And I realized that I want to do it. And even though it's probably, it feels like such a small thing in the middle of everything that's going on, they're looking for folks to just add on their names to this in terms of people who are impacted by it. And it is a numbers thing in the sense that the folks who wrote the Harper's Magazine letter were a really small elite, a really small subset of the people who are at the top of these different institutions. But there are all these people who are coming from all these different experiences and butting heads with the people at the top in these industries that are like, impacted by the ideas that are presented in the letter. And there's a lot more of them. So I decided to sign on, and I'm also asked to share it with a few folks who I think might be interested, and a whole system set up. And I eventually reached out to Shannon and Siobhán about it, and they also decided to sign on to the letter.
Great. So Shannon, why don't you talk about your involvement and your decision around signing the letter?
Yeah, so like Miho said, she is the one that originally got the letter and passed it along to us to look at. Yeah, and it wasn't a moment where we were really at the height of the uprising here in the US. And so when the original Harper's letter came out, for me, it was just like, are you serious? Like right now with everything going on, this is how y'all are spending your time, and you're worried about this like cancel culture, which again, like Miho said, the letter that we signed on to, it is long because it went, paragraph by paragraph through the original Harper's letter and pointed out that all of these things that they're kind of vaguely gesturing to and like potential scenarios that they're trying to highlight of people being canceled, that didn't actually happen when you look at the scenarios themselves. Like all of these people pretty much still have their jobs, and still have their platform. Like J.K. Rowling still makes a ton of money and like has movies coming out. So it was a moment of frustration. And so when Miho sent the letter along to me, it was such a comprehensive response to all of the I think that Harper's letter was intentionally vague because if they had said everything or really highlighted all the scenarios, it would be apparent that, what they're talking about is, I don't like being called out on Twitter for talking about transphobic things. And so, yeah, I think just like the thoroughness that the people who'd originally written the letter, I just really appreciated. And, as a junior scholar in academia, I have seen, I am a white person in the academy. And so, I don't feel like the same kind of silencing that I know a lot of my colleagues do. And so when I was sent this letter, it felt important for me to kind of lend my weight to it. And it was, I looked at it also as kind of like a numbers game of, that Harper's letter got a decent amount of support. Granted, yes, from like a small subset of like more elite people in journalism and in academia. But it was a small, easy, quick way for me to lend my weight to something that hits close to home.
Siobhán, what about you?
So I'm based in the UK and had been aware of the original Harper's Letter. The story here only really broke because J.K. Rowling was attached to it, however, and I think it maybe wouldn't have otherwise have been in the UK news media had this high-profile British author not been one of the signatories, and her transphobia was not kind of a current issue at the time. That said, it meant that it wasn't really getting much high-profile coverage. So when Miho contacted me to let me know about the open letter being put together in response, I felt it was really important to support it, and just really wonderful that it was happening, because a narrative was in danger of being set without being contested. And certainly the kind of the international viewing of that. I think that the fact that it's long is really revealing and important for us to kind of recognize that to repudiate opinions that are just kind of thrown out there takes a lot longer. So, you know, explaining why something is wrong or ill-informed or correcting a falsehood is a lot more laborious than just saying that's not accurate. But I think the existence of the letter is important in kind of setting out that stall, because now it's on the record, it's out there as a reference point, as a counterpoint, and so whenever this Harper's letter comes up, it can be it's there. You know, if you Google the Harper's letter, you also get this response popping up. Knowing that's going to happen, that list of who's signing it and lots of people signing it becomes even more important, right? Because then it becomes an issue of if there is pushback against the reply, then the reply has to have not only all of its kind of sources accurately detailed, which it does, but having that kind of weight of endorsement behind it means that it's that much harder for people to dismiss it, or for people to claim that it's not representative of a broad variety of opinion, and to say that it's not really impactful. And so I was very happy to support it as an academic, but also as a journalist. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Yeah, just in terms of the process, I think it's important maybe to just mention that the organizer of the letters took a lot of care in making sure that the signatories knew exactly what they were signing on for. And that's a counter to the reality of the original letter, which was published without signatories knowing who else was signing it. And so it's been suggested that without seeing kind of the final version of the letter. And so what happened was, consequently, some people who were originally stated signatories removed their name and said, no, I don't want to be associated with this letter. I don't want to be associated with these other signatories. And so I really appreciated the fact that from the outset, the writers of this letter, when they were inviting people to sign, made it very clear that you could state an intention to sign or an interest in signing, but that they would ensure that you saw the final version before asking to confirm that you wanted to be involved in it. And so that might seem like a minor point, but I think that kind of ethics of involvement and an ethics of practice is something that's missing so often in journalism and in newsrooms. And so it was kind of not only the act of signing the letter, but the process of and so not only the act of signing the letter and the content of the letter, but the process through which it was put together, I think actually can be held up as an example of a different way of working. And so it's that kind of practicing what you preach, and the letter writers were certainly doing that. And that's something I really appreciated.
Yes, and I understand that someone who signed the original letter actually ended up signing the response letter as well, correct?
I'm actually unaware of that detail, but that is hilarious.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe that's some fake news. Yeah, because I was doing some research and looking up different articles, and there is allegedly a historian who signed the original letter and asked to have her name removed, and supposedly signed the response letter.
Honestly, I would hope that folks who signed on to the original letter would have read this, the ones that we signed, and would have found it at least compelling, if not a full, did a full 180 on their stance. That's being idealist. So fingers crossed that's true.
Okay, yes, I will make sure I'll get some info on that and bring it up in a few minutes. But yeah, we were talking about, you all were talking about how getting a certain number of folks to sign, or as many people as possible to sign, was a priority, and it wasn't about a whole bunch of people being involved in crafting the letter, right? So in terms of this numbers game that you all mentioned, I wanted you to talk about the significance of, well, you've already talked about the significance of signing the letter, but I want you to talk about your process around choosing to sign the letter in a specific way. So all of you have anthro degrees and could have signed, your names, anthropologist, but you did not. All of you kind of made different decisions around that. And I'd like you to talk about your decisions. And let's start with Siobhán.
Sure. So as being mentioned, I see myself as an academic. I am an academic. I shouldn't say see myself as one. I am an academic, and I'm also a journalist. So I'm on the editorial collective for this magazine, Red Pepper magazine. That's my shameless plugging. And we are a explicitly left-wing publication, green publication, feminist, anti-racist publication, and so. Instinctively, I kind of identified with the contents of the letter, talking about racism in newsrooms, in journalism, from that perspective of a journalist. But the themes that were being discussed in the letter, in the original Harpers Letter, and in the response, echoed what's happening in discourses around college campuses in the United States, but also very much in the United Kingdom and society more generally. And this idea that a dangerously left-wing group of people are shutting down debate by kind of demanding that people are, not offensive, which is it's a very smart tactic. It's a very right-wing tactic, and it's a very paradoxical one, right? So it's this idea that the people who are saying we need a recognition of how racism operates on college campuses, or we need a recognition of how sexism operates in newsrooms, are being told that by raising those questions, they are in fact shutting down free speech. And it's a very insidious narrative, but it's one that is really catching fire and becoming very, very popular. And that's the crux of the Harpers Letter. And so you have these very high profile people, as Shannon's mentioned, these kind of millionaire global elites who are quite far removed perhaps from structures of oppression that are impacting so many around the world and within their own spheres, that they see their position as under threat because someone is saying to them, I'm going to hold you accountable for your actions. Someone is saying to them, I'm afraid you're actually ill-informed. And when you put out an ill-informed view on Twitter, the response is actually, here are the receipts that show that you are factually wrong. And so I felt that I had two options, that I could sign it as an academic or as a journalist. But ultimately, I'm a junior academic, and one who at the end of this temporary contract might not be an academic for very long. I don't have a high profile voice, and with academia, there's always a danger that you're speaking for yourself, and so that you're taken as speaking as an individual rather than on behalf of an institution. And so I chose to sign the letter as an editor of Red Pepper magazine, because I spoke to the rest of the collective and said, has anyone got any problems with me doing this? And everyone was fine with that. And so I signed it as a journalist and as a representative of a particular publication, because doing so is a way of saying, not only do I feel this way as an individual, but the institution and the publication also agrees with this. And in this context, for a journalistic publication to say, we disagree with this framing, right? That we don't think that conversation is being shut down. Quite the opposite, actually, is much more, I think, powerful and useful. And I mean, one thing that I think is maybe we might come back to later on, but we talk about the signatories to the original letter. It's also worth just thinking about the fact that there was a publisher of that letter. And so Harper's magazine, how that fits into this kind of ecosystem of elite interests, and this idea about who decides what is free speech and what is an attempt to shut it down is related to that as well. So that's where I was coming from in signing the letter from an editorial perspective.
Shannon, what about you?
Yeah, I chose to sign the letter as an anthropologist. I think I said from American University. Yeah, I think that this moment has been really interesting, doesn't quite capture it well, but it's been an interesting moment, for lack of a better word, and this kind of like reckoning of how race, gender, all of these categories impact the way that we navigate the world, and especially in academia. There's been, well, I guess especially in academia, because that's the circles that I really work in, there's been a serious like reckoning with how academia is inherently an anti-Black institution, and how race plays out in departments, for example. And so we've seen that in our department as well here at AU. And so I think that so many so I'm a PhD candidate now, and so many people at my level in academia, it seems, are doing like really hard work to try and push back against a lot of the kind of institutionalized racism that folks deal with in academia. And it's not been an easy fight, because we are really not in a position of great power, right? And I think that was like one of the interesting things about the signatories, and like the reason why it needed, I'm thinking more about like, why did we need to have so many signatures on it? And I think it's because like most of us are either at like lower levels in academia or in journalism. You know, we're not working for Harper's Magazine. We're not coming from, you know, we're not tenured professors at Yale or Columbia. And so to like give it more authority, it's like we needed more of us to like sign on and lend it that weight. Whereas like Noam Chomsky could publish something just under his name and people would be like, neat, this is an authoritative writing. And so, yeah, I think it was important for me to sign it as an academic, because academia has a lot to reckon with it, especially anthropology. And these kind, like the way that people have gotten silenced in academia and continue to be silenced in academia is profound and significant. And so many scholars get pushed out of academic circles who really, you know, deserve to be here, while a lot of people hold on to their tenure and are still around. And it's, you know, it's just so, it's really frustrating to watch. And I think that, you know, we need to really continue to have these hard conversations.
Yeah, thanks. Miho?
Yeah, you know, I'd like to add to what Shannon was saying about, you know, the importance about thinking about signatures as kind of showing collectivity, and how that plays into power and the weight of the letter, and as a strategy, right? And I think it's important to say that the idea of a numbers game in this framing, it's not like trying to spam the bottom of a letter with a bunch of signatures, but it was about, you know, for every editor that there was on the first letter, there was like, you know, 50 people who worked under them, and literally in my case, right? For every like public intellectual that's tenured and on the first letter, there were, you know, X amount of students in junior, you know, academics and not junior academics who were colleagues who signed on to the second letter. And that numbers game isn't really just about like the literal numbers, but the actual like reminder that these institutions may be spearheaded by particular folks with particular interests or views, but there are a lot of people who do labor in these different industries that completely disagree or are actively like really struggling in the industry because of a lot of injustices that that first letter just seemed to kind of like brush off. And then the other thing, I'll just add for my signature, I'm not going to lie, I panicked. I did not write anything I could have probably written next to my name. I wrote like archival work or something along those lines. And I distinctly remember, thinking that process through a little bit and being like, how am I going to sign this? I don't want to, associate myself with the place that I'm currently working at, because frankly, this letter was shared among colleagues in a positive light in that space. And it didn't feel safe, right? Which just kind of adds to the weight of it for me personally to this letter. And then the flip side is I've gigged around a lot. Like I've jumped from place to place, taking like minimum wage work in these industries. And what that means is like what you do 6 months will change, quite a bit. And so you don't really get an official title. You kind of become like a Swiss Army knife in terms of skills and the things that you produce. And I remember feeling like I couldn't put down academia because I had just graduated, but I wanted it to be tied to what I was doing. Like I somehow wanted to be tied to my labor. And then I panicked and wrote archival stuff, because right now what I'm currently doing is pretty much in that frame. I probably would have signed it with something else, but I think at least my heart was in the right place when I wrote that.
Right. Well, I mean, and there is a lot of risk involved. I mean, that's something that that's a significant thread that ran through all of your responses. And so that has to be taken seriously. One of the other things that you all have mentioned is that this is a time of great reckoning. We all know that. I know that all of you are actively involved in protests and other actions being taken during this time of reckoning. And so to some of the points that you all made earlier, there's all this stuff going on, and Harper's decides to publish this letter, like that, what is that about? And so similarly, I would imagine you all might have been thinking the same thing in terms of turning your attention toward a letter like this and signing. So I want you to talk about how you see the letter being connected to your larger kind of political practice and political commitments. And let's start with Shannon.
Yeah, big question. Yeah, so kind of like I was saying a minute ago, okay, let me back up. So I've been super involved mostly the first 2 months of the uprisings. Spent a lot of time down by the White House. And I think that we need to take varied approaches to the way that we engage with these moments. And so I think, taking to the streets is super important, and it can be super powerful, and it can generate great change. But I think it's also important for us to engage, like I said earlier, with things that are closer to home. And so, if I feel like, me being out there, mostly taking support roles and trying to keep everyone safe in really unsafe situations is super important. But also, if I'm doing that without trying to clean up my own house, I guess, and trying to really take those struggles into my workplace, then I'm kind of missing a big part of the impact that I can have. And like I said earlier, I'm a white person in academia, I am a woman, but largely these spaces were built for me. And so thinking about this risk that you brought up, I feel like I'm in a position to take that risk greater, both in the streets, volunteering to be the one arrested, or, putting my name to a letter like this that's kind of calling out. It was largely, I think, geared towards journalists, but, academia sees the same kind of insistence on you know, the idea of free speech that gets like super fuzzy and contested, and you know, everyone loves free speech. Who wouldn't support that, right? But like Siobhán was talking about earlier, that gets so like, that's one of the big things that right-wingers, fascists, and conservatives love to pick up. It's a huge tactic for them and has been for a long time. And you know, I think just like remembering that and how that plays out in our departments and our classrooms it's really important to keep in mind, like, what is free speech? What does it mean? What work is it? What work is like labeling certain things as freedom of speech doing to kind of erase a lot of the harm and violence that's done? And like we've talked about before, I think that Harper's letter really, its significance shifted based on who signed it, very much so. And so, yeah, I'm rambling now, but I mean, all my politics, everything I do fits within my politics, and I try to be very intentional about that, both when I'm teaching a class, or going to a department meeting, or going to a protest, or you know, doing the mutual aid work I do. It's all framed within the context of, you know, pushing for anti-racist policies, pushing for structural changes that can make everything safe and equitable. Yeah, and more rooted in kind of liberation work, which, yeah, I think the Harper's letter, yeah, I think we just need to be like really, really cognizant of what the work of freedom of speech does and how that fits within certain politics or gets used as often as a way to actually silence people. And that's very prevalent in academia, I think.
Mm-hmm. Miho, what about you?
Yeah, that's a really big question. And it's one that I'm still grappling with, what it means for someone like me to be doing any sort of work that speaks to activism and tries to move things along towards a more, you know, equal and justice-oriented society. But I know in the context of this letter, it was, so it's, I should probably mention this first, like before the pandemic, I was very comfortable with jumping into crowds. I was very comfortable with going and marching. And I mean, Shannon and I have photos of us being angry and disgusting, running around the streets. And that was a way for me, that was really important for me, right? That engagement was really important for me. I had a friend who, you know, we finished, you know, running around doing something one day, and they just kind of turned to me and they're like, you really, like, your activism is really physical, isn't it? And it was like, yeah, like it was really, you know, the embodiment of being out there was really important to me. But I'm also high risk. So when the pandemic hit and everything started to go down, it was probably something that I'm still like dealing with, is that not because of having to stay inside, not because of not being able to go out.
Right. Well, I mean, and there is a lot of risk involved. I mean, that's something that that's a significant thread that ran through all of your responses. And so that has to be taken seriously. One of the other things that you all have mentioned is that this is a time of great reckoning. We all know that. I know that all of you are actively involved in protests and other actions being taken during this time of reckoning. And so to some of the points that you all made earlier, you know, there's all this stuff going on, and Harper's decides to publish this letter, you know, like that, what is that about? And so similarly, I would imagine you all might have been thinking the same thing in terms of turning your attention toward a letter like this and signing. So I want you to talk about how you see the letter being connected to your larger kind of political practice and political commitments. And let's start with Shannon.
Yeah, big question. Yeah, so kind of like I was saying a minute ago, okay. let me back up. So I've been super involved mostly the first 2 months of the uprisings. Spent a lot of time down by the White House. And I think that we need to take varied approaches to the way that we engage with these moments. And so I think, taking to the streets is super important, and it can be super powerful, and it can generate great change. But I think it's also important for us to engage, like I said earlier, with things that are closer to home. And so, if I feel like, me being out there, mostly taking support roles and trying to keep everyone safe in really unsafe situations is super important. But also, if I'm doing that without trying to clean up my own house, I guess, and trying to really take those struggles into my workplace, then I'm kind of missing a big part of the impact that I can have. And like I said earlier, I'm a white person in academia, I am a woman, but largely these spaces were built for me. And so thinking about this risk that you brought up, I feel like I'm in a position to take that risk greater, both in the streets, volunteering to be the one arrested, or putting my name to a letter like this that's kind of calling out. It was largely, I think, geared towards journalists, but academia sees the same kind of insistence on the idea of free speech that gets super fuzzy and contested, and everyone loves free speech. Who wouldn't support that, right? But like Siobhán was talking about earlier, that gets so that's one of the big things that right-wingers, fascists, and conservatives love to pick up. It's a huge tactic for them, and has been for a long time. And I think just remembering that and how that plays out in our departments and our classrooms, it's really important to keep in mind, what is free speech? What does it mean? What work is labeling certain things as freedom of speech doing to kind of erase a lot of the harm and violence that's done. And like we've talked about before, I think that Harper's letter, really, its significance shifted based on who signed it. Very much so. And so, yeah, I'm rambling now, but I mean, all my politics, everything I do fits within my politics. And I try to be very intentional about that, both when I'm teaching a class, or going to a department meeting, or going to a protest, or, doing the mutual aid work I do. It's all framed within the context of, pushing for anti-racist policies, pushing for structural changes that can make everything safe and equitable. Yeah, and more rooted in kind of liberation work, which, yeah, I think the Harper's letter, yeah, I think we just need to be really, really cognizant of what the work of freedom of speech does and how that fits within certain politics, or gets used as often as a way to actually silence people. And that's very prevalent in academia, I think.
Mm-hmm. Miho, what about you?
Yeah, that's a really big question. And it's one that I'm still grappling with, what it means for someone like me to be doing any sort of work that speaks to activism and tries to move things along towards a more, equal and justice-oriented society. But I know in the context of this letter, it was, so it's, I should probably mention this first. Before the pandemic, I was very comfortable with jumping into crowds. I was very comfortable with going and marching. And I mean, Shannon and I have photos of us being angry and disgusting, running around the streets. And that was a way for me, that was really important for me, right? That engagement was really important for me. I had a friend who, we finished, running around doing something one day, and they just kind of turned to me and they're like, you really your activism is really physical, isn't it? And it was like, yeah, like it was really, the embodiment of being out there was really important to me. But I'm also high risk. So when the pandemic hit and everything started to go down, it was probably something that I'm still like dealing with, is that not because of having to stay inside, not because of not being able to go out with friends or happy hour or whatever, because I wasn't able to go out and protest and act in the way that I wanted to and was used to and was my comfort zone in that space. I had felt the most isolated I had ever felt, and or at least I had felt in a long time. And that was really painful. So I started to like figure out different ways that I could stay involved, right? Funneling money is always a great way if you happen to have a job, and I've been lucky to be able to keep mine recently. But also just like writing was a really big part of it. Looking and connecting with folks who are doing more non-physical based work too, and seeing what they're doing. And actually looking back, thinking about this question, I wonder if one of the reasons why this letter even, this person that I know, this connection who had been working on this letter even thought to reach out to me, was because I had been a little bit more active in like that online space, and, had been reaching out to different folks and sharing that I had been doing these things. And I still don't have all the answers to like how to deal with if you're a person who likes to do physical engagement work, and like what that means to do it in the pandemic if you're high risk. Like I'm still working my way through that. But the letter was like an extension of me trying to just find like whatever I can grasp at, right? To kind of push anything forward, to put that energy somewhere. And it's maybe, it's different than yelling in the street. And I'm one of those who generally tends to avoid arrest when I'm out, but I don't try to avoid arrest that hard. So, but it's like, it's something that I think I'm still working my brain around. What that would mean for how my activism might be changing right now. And also, now I'm starting to have to think about, this might be going on for a while. So I can't just like take a break from being out on the street and then like return out there in a couple months from now. I'm going to have to start building strategies and start learning and engaging in strategies that will be safe for me, that it won't land me in the hospital after like just a little bit of contact. So I'm lucky though, I would say, in the sense that I'm far from alone in that circumstance, one, and two, there's a whole legacy of people who have done really important physical work of using their bodies and putting their bodies on the line, and then other folks who have found other creative ways to contribute. And so I'm just trying to learn from kind of people who maybe they reach for their pen first, instead of a protest sign, and other folks who have found more creative ways or just even subversive ways to kind of push against what's going on without having to put themselves at physical risk.
Siobhán, what about you?
Yeah, I think in the context that the both us were published and that Miho and Shannon have been talking about, it's the context of not only a sum of uprisings with a reiteration and a strengthening, I think, of the Black Lives Matter movement, but recognizing that's been going on for the last 6 years, but also in this context of the global pandemic and what's happening at the moment in the United States, but not only in the United States, but just focusing on the United States, is kind of the equivalent of martial law in some places. There are armed militias killing protesters in the streets. There is the continuation of policemen killing predominantly unarmed black men in terms of when it's hitting the headlines, but there are police killing people all the time in the United States, and armed militias doing the same. And I think that's sometimes it becomes so normalized that it becomes kind of strange to be kind of reminded that that's not the kind of normal that we should accept, and it's not certainly not the normal that we should be willing to return to. And so I think that a lot of the protests can be seen as reactive, but I think they're also setting out a vision of how we want the world to be better, and how we want our communities to be better, and the nation states in which we live to be better. And I see that as happening on the streets, but also in the discursive context. So when you write a letter, the original letter from all these elites was a statement of how they wanted the world to be and how they felt the world should be, and the danger that it was kind of being taken away from them was laughable in that context, where there are trans women, there are particularly trans women of colour, being murdered in this as they go about their lives. And the idea that questioning their right to exist, getting an upset response from people is more of a threat to society than the actual killing of trans women is so preposterous, right? And so I think that we have to be proactive and reactive in saying that's not the reality we want to see in our worlds. And so how does that fit with myself and signing the letter? So I'm a white woman with quite ample privilege. For me, signing the letter and putting my name to it was could potentially have repercussions, but I don't think very serious ones. I don't feel under threat, but I recognise that so many people sign that letter and they have very good reason to withhold their names, because they will suffer repercussions for doing something as small as that. In some ways, it's quite a small act, but it's one that is powerful, but one that can have very serious repercussions. Whereas for someone like J.K. Rowling, there's no repercussion. For a lot of white people, a lot of white men particularly, but not only, there's this concept of failing upwards. So that scandal that would devastate you if you were of a different embodiment is fine. I mean, Louis C.K. he's going to bounce back. Donald Trump, he's going to bounce back. J.K. Rowling, she's going to fail up, right? And so this is happening in the UK as well, where extraordinarily mediocre actor and singer Lawrence Fox kind of became held up as a hero for saying that anti-racism had gone too far, and actually now white men like him were having their kind of culture oppressed. So he's part of an acting dynasty and has been given this like free reign. So you get these kind of wild warpings of reality. And I think so setting out a stall and saying, actually, that's not how things are, but it's also not how things should be is really important at this time, but also in all time. And I wanted to say that not signing the letter was important for me, but reading the letter was important for me. So I learned from reading the letter, reading the experiences of particularly people of colour working in US newsrooms invited me to reflect on what I need to do differently, what I need to do better as someone who works in journalism, someone who works in academia, and reflect critically on my own failings, right, and how I'm failing at times to recognise or use my privilege in ways that are productive towards building that world. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to kind of say that it was very useful to read the letter and learn from it. I think the good note, or the positive note I'd strike about kind of the context that we're in is that the fact that the Harpers Letter was written and published perhaps means that we're we're doing all right. It means that people are scared. It means that elites feel threatened, and that people who do say or do perpetuate transphobic or racist or sexist ideas feel that they might not be so secure in their ability to do that anymore. And although that's maybe too optimistic or maybe a bit naive, I think we can look at the existence of the letter as elites feeling cornered, and maybe that's a sign that that we're doing the right thing in general in terms of our activism, whether it's online or on the streets or in local politics, national politics, in our classrooms, however it may be. If they're feeling under threat, then that's probably a good thing. And Miha, I would not downplay the importance of non-physical activists. I mean, when we see the success of YouTube channels and radio shows led by fascists and groups that are members of groups that are kind of planning terrible future, terrible acts. Like I don't want to kind of name names and give anyone any more volume or airtime, but I think we know who I'm talking about, right? So I think we've seen over recent years the immense power that a digital platform can have, and so we shouldn't kind of downplay that.
Absolutely. I remember during the conversation we had prior to recording, we talked about freedom and the importance of freedom, and how you saw signing the letter as an extension of the fight for freedom. And I think it's really significant in the context you're talking about here, because we would be remiss if we did not mention that the primary drafters, or some of the leading drafters of the Harpers Letter, were people of color, right? So, I mean, there's also the matter of kind of taking a critical look at power, and that power is not about, okay, well, these folks are in power now and we just want to flip it where some other folks are in power, and the same distributions of resources and power remain. No, we want to abolish all of this. We need to abolish that structure, that dynamic. And so what you're saying about freedom of speech and kind of critically looking at that, I think is really important in that context. So, okay, I have one last big picture question for you. So you all started out talking about the specifics of your involvement in signing the counter letter, and then you moved on to how you connect that to your broader political practice. And so now what I want to ask you in closing is to talk about your identification as an anthropologist, because we're going to have a lot of, in particular, undergraduates watching this, and they might have questions for you, by the way. We'll talk about that later, but I'd like you to talk about how perhaps you see yourself existing within and outside of anthropology, or how perhaps you intentionally situate yourself within and outside anthropology relative to all of your identities, and how it relates to your agendas as scholars and activists. And let's start with Miho. How about you?
Sure. So that's a tough one. I think it's tough for me because for a really long time, I felt really enamored with the identification of anthropologist. And a part of that has to do with, I remember I was in high school and not planning to go to college, and I came across an anthropology piece, Shakespeare in the Bush. And it was so intriguing to me because of coming from a multicultural background. I realized it was like this open door to this discipline that had a language to help me kind of articulate the really strange experiences that I've had. And, on top of being concerned with power, right? But as I have done, I would say as I've gotten more intimate with the scene of like academia and anthropology, it's tough to feel like I can identify that way. And I'm still working through all the reasons why, but what I can say is that I've decided to frame things currently now as more like a verb more so than as a descriptor for me. And that's helped me feel like I can still stay engaged with this discipline that can be so critical and can be really focused on trying to articulate the human experience, this thing that like I really like fell in love with, or at least a way of thinking and a way of engaging with ideas that I really fell in love with, without having to endorse like the whole institution of anthropology. And I also say that kind of like, and with the privilege of, not working necessarily immediately in academia. That probably, maybe I wouldn't really even have that choice if I was still working in the academy or for like a higher institution. But like, even like on my Twitter bio, in part because of characters, but like, I don't put anthropologist anymore. I put anthropology. This is the subject within anthropology that I'm interested in. Like, I put anthropology, Asian American activism, and like material culture. Because, for me, I'm trying to keep it as like a thing that you do and framing it as like a type of inquiry. And that's been really useful for me. But, in terms of identifying as like a scholar activist, like, of course, anthropology is so important to like that construction of myself, and it guides me and with like whatever I do 100%. I think that the ways that I find it like continuously grounds me is like just reminding myself to consider, dynamics of power, but then also what it means to better the everyday conditions of people, like the material everyday conditions of people living in this country, or in the United States, because this is where I'm currently residing and is my immediate community, what it means to just make that like that morning better for someone, make a person who is cold in the afternoon less cold, right? And that's a really particular type of like anthropological thinking. And I 100% put my anthropologist cap on when I'm trying to make a decision about where to put my resources or what action or like sort of thing is important for me to like sign on to or endorse. And I think the letter feels so far from like that kind of like material conversation, because it is in like these institutions where we're talking about like journalists, and also 100% I endorse what Siobhán said about the caveat of non-physical labor being really important in terms of moving the line. 100% on the YouTube algorithm. But I think that when it comes to talking about writing the letter, I really did like, I used that anthropology hat to think about it as like a labor thing, right? Like making that connection of all of these editors have probably made a decision about not publishing a particular piece because it would offend somebody who's on their board, or would maybe not get the most clicks, right? Because again, I have seen those decisions be made, and it feels so ironic when the original Harper's Letter is so concerned with censorship, is so concerned with freedom of speech, and the question is, whose freedom of speech, right? And like, is it genuinely free? Is that what you're really advocating for? You're worried about your rights to not just cause offense, right? To actively share dehumanizing ideology that impacts the physical well-being, or like the, has physical consequences on vulnerable bodies. And of course, I'm thinking about J.K. Rowling's transphobic views right now.
Sure.
But you're concerned about not being able to share that and
Right.
not receiving any sort of pushback. So yeah.
Thanks. Siobhán?
Yeah, so when so this is for undergraduates. So when I started university, I had no idea what anthropology was. I signed up for a class and I met all these people who had gone to university to study anthropology, and I just thought, wow, what did you know that I didn't know? Because I didn't know what it was. And I think what Miho was saying about the methods and lens that it gives you is kind of what appealed to me kind of most of all. And as an undergraduate, it felt like a forum through which I would be able to kind of learn methods and do research that that I felt was politically important more than other disciplines. And I do understand and recognise that that the anthropology has a race problem, but society has a race problem, and education has a race problem. And so this idea that like the existence of colonial and racist and white supremacist practices in anthropology is one that's echoed in sociology, in history, in geography, in literature. And so I'm very kind of cognizant of how that's sometimes used as a way for other types of scholars to kind of be less critically reflective. But I think it's important that all anthropologists are continuously critically reflective on that history and see that the legacies of the foundings of the discipline in the present, because they very much continue. But I'm very proud to be an anthropologist. At the same time, when I think about myself as a scholar, I think it's important not to romanticize that. And Rachel, when we were talking last week in preparation, you were saying that you'd grown up with a strong understanding of kind of the difference between the importance of seeing the things that you do as a job and not as a vocation, in the way that you could then be opened up to exploitation. And I think that's for me very important, especially. I don't say especially now because I'm living it, but yeah, I'm sure it was like this for many other people at different times. But the reality is that the institutions that we are studying and working in are neoliberal institutions. They're quite extractive. They're founded on the idea that you should pay, that people should pay for access to education, and that higher levels of education should be more easily accessible to people with higher levels of income, which is when I went to university in the UK, everyone in the country, regardless of what you were studying and where you were studying, paid the same flat rate for the course, and that flat rate was £1,000 a year, which is still more than my parents paid to say that they went to university at a time when it was much more accessible. But in a very short period of time, the cost of going to university has skyrocketed in the UK. Universities are becoming privatised and charging more and more money, and that money is going to people who have high-ranking positions. That money is being spent on marketing campaigns and cosmetics. Disciplines like anthropology that are not big money spinners because they are critical of power generally don't get much attention in this neoliberal model. They don't get much funding, and they're under risk of closure. So I think it's very important to kind of keep, as a scholar activist, to keep fighting for the rights of students to access education, and for colleagues to be able to teach whilst being fairly remunerated and supported by the institutions. And what does that look like? I mean, I think it looks like joining your union and being willing to strike. Recently I took maybe I'll ask you to edit this out, but recently I was asked to basically I was kind of offered a teaching position, but because my salary is paid by a research fund, I wouldn't be paid any more for teaching. And and I wouldn't be given any time off from research to do that. But it was kind of framed to me as this would be good for my career. But it meant that someone else, it's not that I wouldn't get paid, but it means that someone else is not getting paid. So someone who lost their job in the recent cutbacks is not being rehired, or they're not being replaced. So someone's losing a job, someone's losing pay if I take that job. So I said that I couldn't take it. And so I don't know if that will kind of damage my career prospects. As I say, maybe I won't be able to be a scholar. But I think that if I can't be a scholar whilst also being an activist in that sense, then it's not worth doing. So I think that for me, they're intertwined for better or worse.
Nice. Yes. What about you, Shannon?
Yeah, I think I'm in a complicated relationship with anthropology, in that, as Siobhán and Miho have both said, it was really kind of an entry point for me to start thinking critically about the world, about human lives outside of, I'm from North Carolina, and I'd always had this like passionate interest. I wanted to travel. I loved history. And my mom, one day I was like a junior in high school, she was like, I think you want to be an anthropologist. She's like, I think you're
Wow.
so interested in like the people and the culture, you want to travel. I think you want to be an anthropologist. And I was like, neat. Okay, we'll give it a go. And so I went to undergrad, planning to major in anthropology. I did. Everyone told me I would change my major, but joke's on them. I'm now on my third anthropology degree. And yeah, it's really given, like Miho was saying, it's given me that lens, the framework, the language to look around and analyze the awful things that happen in the world and like really understand like what's happening there, what are the processes at play, and why do these kind of things happen. And I remember I still, you know, when I started as an undergrad, I was like, historical archaeology, this is it, I'm gonna play in the dirt. And then I took a global studies class that was like, we're gonna look around at all of these awful things that are going on around the globe. And I was like, I think I should do something different than archaeology, which, no offense to the archaeologists, I know that also now I've learned, I know that also plays like a really vital role in liberation politics. So no offense, Dan.
Right.
But
You heard it here.
yeah, so yeah, I mean, in terms of like thinking about power dynamics and how that plays out, that was a really, you know, my education and my development as an anthropologist was really, I mean, vital, instrumental, centered in my politics and my growth and my politics and my radicalization, and looking around and really seeing that something was drastically wrong. And you know, with that, anthropology is such an interesting discipline, because we are so, well, should be so cognizant of that colonial past, and the racist roots of our discipline, along with like, you know, academia in general, right? Like the way that we go about research and study is so rooted in colonial logics, not just in anthropology, but we're, I think, unlike some other disciplines, like so cognizant of it and self-critical and critical of the discipline, that, yeah, I think that's where my complicated relationship comes in. But, you know, I really love sorry, my dog is just being ridiculous.
I love it. Yes, we love it. I'm in love with what anthropology could be, should be, and sometimes is, and the work that some people are doing is just absolutely phenomenal. And you know, because of that, you know, like anthropology was my path to, you know, developing and growing politically, and now I'm kind of turning that lens back on the discipline itself and saying, you know, how can we change these structures, and how can we, you know, make anthropology do like use anthropology to do really important liberatory work, and how can we, you know, change the discipline, and not just the discipline, but right, like Siobhán's talking about, like the academic institution, so that we
can keep doing this important research, and like shift the way that we do our work in a way that is liberatory and radical and wonderful.
I think that's a perfect way to end. And I think we're like at 60 minutes to the second. So this was fantastic. I want to thank you all so much. This was great. I think the undergrads and I think everybody in the department is going to enjoy watching this. So thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.